A quiet morning before disaster. On the morning of December 26, 2004, the Indian Ocean lay calm under a bright sky. Holiday travelers wandered along beaches in Thailand. Fishermen in Indonesia prepared their nets, and families in Sri Lanka and India went about their routines. Nothing suggested that within minutes, the earth beneath the ocean would unleash one of the most destructive events in modern history. At 7:58 a.m. local time, a massive rupture occurred along the boundary between the Indian plate and the Burma microplate. Enormous tectonic stress that had accumulated over centuries suddenly released in a megathrust earthquake, measuring between 9.1 and 9.3 in magnitude. The rupture stretched more than 1,300 kilometers and forced sections of the ocean floor upward by as much as 15 meters. This displacement instantly set in motion a series of waves that would travel across the Indian Ocean with devastating consequences. The birth of the tsunami. The violent uplift of the seafloor displaced trillions of tons of water and generated a tsunami of extraordinary magnitude. In deep water, these waves moved silently at speeds approaching 800 kilometers per hour, making them almost indetectable to ships at sea. But as the waves approached shallower coastal waters, their energy compressed upward and transformed them into towering walls of water. The tsunami radiated outward from the epicenter, targeting coastlines near and far. Indonesia, closest to the rupture and least prepared for such an event, would face the strongest and most immediate blow. Indonesia, the first and worst hit. The Indonesian province of Aceh, on northern Sumatra, was devastated within minutes. Residents had barely recovered from the violent shaking when the sea began to withdraw dramatically from the shore. Many people walked out onto the exposed seafloor, curious about the sudden retreat. Few recognized it as nature's urgent warning. When the first wave arrived, it towered as high as 30 meters in some areas and crashed ashore with unimaginable force. Entire villages were obliterated in seconds. Homes, vehicles, bridges, and thousands of lives were swept inland by the churning surge. Banda Aceh, the provincial capital, suffered near total destruction along its coastline. The tsunami wiped out entire neighborhoods, leaving behind vast fields of debris. More than 165,000 Indonesians died, making it the single greatest national tragedy in the event. Survivors described clinging to trees, rooftops, and fragments of debris as the water carried them far from their homes. The human loss was so severe that in many communities, entire families vanished without a trace. Thailand, a tourist paradise, turned to chaos. Approximately 2 hours after the earthquake, the tsunami reached Thailand's western coast. The beaches of Phuket, Khao Lak, and the Phi Phi Islands were filled with tourists enjoying the holiday season. Many people watched the sea withdraw without understanding what it meant, and some recorded it on handheld cameras. When the water returned, it did so with destructive speed. Khao Lak suffered the most catastrophic losses, as the shallow gradient of its shore allowed the waves to penetrate deep inland. Luxurious beachfront resorts were instantly crushed, and countless visitors were caught unaware in ground-level rooms. On the Phi Phi Islands, waves rushed in from both sides of the narrow isthmus, trapping people and destroying buildings, boats, and infrastructure. Thousands perished in Thailand, including many foreign travelers. The event shocked the world because it struck at a time and place familiar to millions of international tourists, making the tragedy deeply global in scope. Sri Lanka, waves without warning. Sri Lanka experienced the tsunami roughly 2.5 hours after the earthquake. The eastern and southern coastlines bore the full impact of the waves, reaching heights of up to 12 meters. In many areas, the sea did not retreat in a noticeable way beforehand, leaving residents with little or no indication that danger was imminent. Coastal villages were inundated within seconds of the waves striking. Schools, shops, temples, and homes collapsed under the force of the water. One of the most devastating single incidents occurred near Purulia, where a packed passenger train known as the Queen of the Sea was struck by the tsunami. The train derailed, and a second wave engulfed it completely, drowning more than 1,500 passengers. This became the deadliest train accident in history. Sri Lanka ultimately lost more than 35,000 people, and entire communities along the coastline were left in ruins. India, a nation caught off guard. India's southeastern coastline, especially Tamil Nadu, faced severe destruction when the waves struck soon after Sri Lanka. Chennai experienced extensive flooding, and fishing villages along the coast were swept away with little warning. Boats were hurled inland, homes shattered, and families torn apart. On the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which lay closer to the epicenter, the destruction was even more profound. Entire settlements were destroyed or permanently altered. Some islands were submerged, and many others lost large portions of their shorelines. India's death toll exceeded 10,000, though remoteness and displacement made accurate counting difficult. The disaster exposed the vulnerabilities of coastal populations living in low-lying regions without access to timely alert systems. The Maldives, islands underwater. As the tsunami moved southwest, it reached the Maldives, a nation composed of low-lying coral islands barely rising above sea level. Even though the waves were lower in height by the time they arrived, the island's geography meant that flooding was nearly unavoidable. The capital city, Malé, was heavily inundated, and several smaller islands were submerged temporarily. While the Maldives recorded fewer deaths compared to other nations, the impact on infrastructure, tourism, and freshwater supplies was severe. Many islands required full evacuations, and some were rendered uninhabitable in the disaster's aftermath. Africa, the tsunami crosses an ocean. The tsunami continued its journey across the Indian Ocean and struck the east coast of Africa several hours after the earthquake. Somalia experienced the most significant damage, with waves flooding coastal communities already struggling with political instability and limited resources. Hundreds died and fishing villages were destroyed. Tanzania, Kenya, and Seychelles also experienced flooding and loss of life. The fact that the tsunami retained destructive force after traveling thousands of kilometers underscored the immense power of the event and its global reach. A worldwide shock and response. In the hours and days following the disaster, the full scale of destruction slowly became known. Communications were severed in many affected regions, leaving the outside world unaware of the unfolding catastrophe. Once images and footage emerged, showing flattened coastlines, devastated towns, and desperate survivors, a global wave of grief and compassion spread. Governments, humanitarian organizations, and individuals around the world mobilized quickly. Search and rescue teams were deployed, emergency supplies were airlifted, and donations poured in from across the globe. The humanitarian response became one of the largest in history, with more than $14 billion committed to relief and reconstruction. The disaster demonstrated the world's capacity for collective action in the face of immense human suffering. Reasons for the high death toll. The tragic loss of life resulted from several converging factors, though these unfolded naturally rather than as separate categories. Foremost was the absence of a tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean. Without a mechanism to alert countries far from the epicenter, millions remained unaware of the approaching danger. Public knowledge about tsunamis was minimal in many affected regions. Few people recognized the withdrawing sea as a deadly warning. Many coastal areas were densely populated with fishing communities whose homes and livelihoods were built close to the water. The timing of the disaster, occurring during a busy holiday season, meant beaches were crowded with tourists unfamiliar with geological hazards. Finally, the sheer scale of the tsunami, born from one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, made survival difficult even for those who attempted to flee.